Welcome back. Welcome back. We are here in chapter 15. We're talking about advertising and public relations. And we're going to focus more on advertising than we will in PR, public relations. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually set the objectives and what those might be. And we'll talk about budgeting. How do you decide how much money you have to spend or how much money you should spend on advertising? And then we'll talk about how do you develop an advertising strategy. So again, something strategic where there's an active plan to achieve some type of goal or goals. And then we'll talk about how do you know if you're getting your money's worth. So ROI, return on investment, as it relates to advertising, a little bit more difficult than traditional promotions. And so we'll talk about some of the ways where it might be a little bit easier to kind of connect whatever the goal or outcome is and achieve the objective and the amount of money that we're actually spending for advertising. And then we have a couple of little loose ends in terms of other things that we want to talk about in terms of advertising generally. And then we'll kind of morph into the role of public relations. Again, very different. PR generally is more reactionary, and advertising is a little bit more proactive. So advertising is basically the paid form of this non-personal presentation. And so it can go through many different types of medium. It could be radio, it could be print, it could be internet, it could be television, cable versus traditional network-based types of programming, all varieties of programming that it's on. It's very fragmented now. I think I mentioned that before in a previous chapter. But advertising generally is the paid form. Public relations generally you try to get some leverage in a non-paid form through press releases, doing interviews, having your product profiled on a show or in a magazine or written up in a newspaper based on some kind of review. But advertising generally, we're trying to be a little bit more proactive, and when we're proactive, we tend to have to pay for that privilege. Now, the general process in terms of decision making and the things that need to be addressed when it comes to advertising, we're going to talk about setting objectives. Generally, they're going to be objectives related to communicating. What's the message that we want to get out to people? What do we want them to believe or think about our brand? And then some of them may be specifically related to units sold. It could be increasing market share for a particular segment or just generally selling more units. It could mean selling more units that have a larger profit margin, thereby increasing your net income. So anything that's measurable generally should be tied to some kind of a goal. And then you have to figure out, whatever the goal might be, how much money do we have to spend? And figure out what formula you want to use to decide how much you can afford to spend. And we'll talk about different approaches, but generally it's what you can afford approach, which I think is probably what I would call a risk-averse type of strategy. And then some are tied to sales goals and what our competitors do. But by and large, it really should, if you want to be aggressive and you need to make up market share as an example, you need to figure out what the objective is and put the money forth or resources forth to make sure you achieve that objective. And then we talk about the different types of messages. What is the message that we want that will help us achieve our goal? And where do we take that message? What type of medium? How often? How frequent? Is it going to be TV, radio, internet? And then at the end of the day, we have to have some kind of evaluation criteria. It could be sales related. It could be market share related. We could look at the return that we're getting on our advertising. We could use some sort of comparative, how much bang we're getting for our buck, advertising versus promotion. Maybe we might want to look at it across different medium that we're using. So how effective is TV relative to the effectiveness of print advertising, as an example. So these advertising objectives, they typically are going to be based on some kind of past decision. I mean, unless you're a startup and you're starting from scratch, usually the first thing you look at is what has been done previously, and that's always going to be a starting point. And then you figure out what types of marketing mix elements will you need to have to achieve these goals and these objectives. But generally, the overarching objective will probably be to do something to inform people, persuade them, or just remind them that the product that you have is superior to others who have offerings in the same marketplace. So when we think about informative advertising, typically this is going to be the type of advertising that is going to be more informational based. And you see that a lot when it comes to what we would call primary types of advertising. And we're going to contrast that in the selective demand types of advertising. Primary demand advertising generally will be advertising that's really trying to grow the category. So think about the Got Milk campaigns that we've seen over the years. The goal there is not to get people to buy any one specific brand of milk, but it's trying to grow the pie, getting people to buy more in the category of milk. Same thing you see with the orange growers, also too those organizations that promote the consumption of chicken or pork. The pork, I think they've ran the other white meat campaign for the longest time. And so they're trying to stimulate primary demand for the category. Versus persuasive advertising is really there to get people to understand that brand A is better than all the other brands in the marketplace. So informative advertising generally is more general. Persuasive advertising, it's really trying to get people to understand that our brand is superior. And reminder advertising, as the word suggests, it's really trying to remind people of all the great things that they hopefully have in terms of feelings about a particular brand. If there are negative impressions of your brand, you're going to have to do some kind of persuasive advertising initially to kind of rub off all the negativity, because you don't want to remind people of a brand that they have negative impressions of. So you got to clean it up first, and that may be done through public relations. But then you can overlay that with some type of reminder advertising of all the great things that they knew about your brand before it might have been hit by some negative event. Now, here are some general examples in terms, or specific examples, broadly speaking, of different types of informative advertising, persuasive and reminder advertising. And so here, where you could look at more informative stuff is, you could inform people, new product to the market, new entrant to the marketplace generally, but generally trying to build an awareness for the benefits that a particular product or category of products provide. Also, too, when we think about persuasive advertising, again, that's where we try to build preferences for a particular brand. And so you are going to connect with a particular target market. If they happen to have an offering that they currently use in the marketplace, you want to give them incentive to switch to your brand, or at least give them incentive to try your brand. So I think the first goal is to get them to try it, to induce trial, as they say. And then once you induce trial, you give people an opportunity to see how great your brand is. Hopefully you can deliver on the goods in terms of how good it is. And that could be performance-based, be it piece of electronic equipment, an automobile. If it's taste in terms of food, you better make sure that whatever the promises you have in your persuasive advertising, that you actually deliver on those. And reminder advertising is really just trying to knock on people's doors and keeping your product in the forefront of their mind when it comes to their selection. Around Christmas time, holiday time, well-established brands, what they typically do is focus more on the reminder advertising, just to remind you that they have a great selection if you're talking about Target, or remind them how much you enjoyed the taste of their wine or their spirit because you consume it over the course of many Christmases and holiday seasons over the past years. So when we set advertising budgets, keep in mind an advertising budget is only one component of an overall promotional mix budget. So you're going to have a separate budget for promotions, separate budget and budgets for consumer promotions and trade promotions, advertising, sponsorship, and also too advertising, if we just look at that as one broad budget, probably not breaking it down into its necessary components, which would make sense. It would be looking at it, for example, how much money do we have to spend on TV? how much money do we have to spend on print advertising? And if we're talking about print advertising, maybe it's what kind of budget do we have for traditional print media like newspapers and magazines. Maybe there's some new and innovative types of print publications that we might want to try. If we're talking about radio, what type of radio are we looking at? We're going to do something on satellite radio. We're going to do something on traditional AM or traditional FM type of radio. Maybe the goal might be to increase market share and we figure out what the budget is. But some other factors that you need to consider is, where is your particular product or brand in the product life cycle? If it's a brand new to the market, introductory type of product, chances are you're going to have to do more an awareness campaign where you're trying to inform people about the benefits. If you're at a maturity stage in the product life cycle, it's really about continuing to remind people about how great your brand is. And contrast that, look at market share depending on where we are with market share. Are we a leader? Are we ahead in the marketplace by 20 points in terms of percentage? Or are we a distant third? Depending on the goal. If the goal is to make up market share, you tend to have to be a little bit more aggressive. So that's why you always see companies who are behind market leaders tend to do more comparative advertising where they're trying to persuade people to at least induce trial. Try our brand. Try Avis. We're just as good as Hertz. Or try Burger King. We're just as great as McDonald's. So always think about the leader in the category. Usually the ones who are trying to make up market share in the marketplace, they tend to be a little bit more aggressive. They want to be seen in the same view or same vein and try to persuade people to at least give their particular brand a try. And it also depends on the dynamics of what's going on in the marketplace. Obviously, if you're in a competitive marketplace, and let's say, for example, I'll throw out a number, the average competitor spends $10 million a year to promote their brand, their competitive brand. At a bare minimum, in order to keep pace, you're going to probably have to spend about the same amount of money. If you say you only have a budget of $1 million, the odds are, unless you do something very creative and you knock it out of the park, you're going to continue to stay behind, if not lose additional market share. So thinking about strategy, I mean, generally when we think about strategy, it's really how can we put forth some ideas strategically that help us accomplish whatever these objectives are. And they tend to be related more so to creating the message and then also selecting the media. And so I kind of like to look at it as, what do you say and where do you say it? So the messaging can be specifically the words that you're going to use to communicate. It could be, I think we talked about encoding. It could be the spokesperson that you're going to use to communicate. And then the selecting media component is, what is the best medium that you need to use to communicate with your primary target market? So if we're talking about very, very young people, under the age of 24, as an example, maybe some of your money really needs to go into internet. So you can execute the same message, but it will be a little bit different because we're looking at it online. Senior citizens over 70 years of age, you probably would stay away from the internet generally and use some of the more old-fashioned traditional medium like television. So what's in a message? The key point here, when we think about the messaging itself, it's really trying to break through the clutter. Think about yourselves as consumers and think about all the messaging that you see, intended or unintended. You run into brand messaging all the time. Messages that are on posters and billboards as you travel from work day in and day out, be it on the freeway or in the subways or in the buses. You're constantly bombarded with that type of messaging. Pick up a magazine or a newspaper constantly. Do your travels on the internet, you'll see you're constantly bombarded with messaging. And so with all of that, we try our best to engage in what I call avoidance of messaging. And so most of us have DVR technology on traditional TV. Great way to avoid messaging. I do it myself. Certain shows that I watch, I'll start it, DVR it, and start watching it 15 minutes in, and I just fast forward the commercial, and I only spend about 45 minutes. Usually for an hour show, it's about 43 minutes of content. maybe 42, and then you have 17, 18 minutes worth of commercials. That's a lot of commercial time. And so if we can avoid those commercials by fast forwarding and use that commercial skip button on the remote control, that's great for us, bad for advertisers. Okay, so advertising, if we think about, actually, again, creating the message, it has to be something that's planned. Unless we're talking about an event that's out in the public live, be it some sort of a remote where we are going to have a celebrity, for example, represent us at some sort of community fair or something along those lines, it's usually planned. And most of the time, I think for this planned type of advertising, it really has to be more imaginative and creative, because we just are very bored. We're bored very easily, and so we channel surf, we multitask. Most people sit there, even if they watch TV at home and watch a program live, they're multitasking on their smartphones, their laptops, their iPads, they're on the phone, they're texting, they're tweeting, they're doing so many things that is distracting. And so in this day and age, probably more so than ever, we need to find a way to create advertising that may be disguised as some kind of entertainment. And so this whole concept of Madison and Vine, which basically takes from two major cities, New York, Madison Avenue, known for advertising, Vine Street, known for development of Hollywood content. And so what we're suggesting here is that we really need to figure out, how do we capture people's attention? One platform that's been very, very successful in doing that is the Super Bowl. I mean, these days, I think many people realize that the Super Bowl is part of the entertainment. And people will actually sit down, not interested in the game, but they'll sit there to watch the ads on the Super Bowl broadcast, because that's going to be probably the best effort of Madison Avenue creative people in a given year. And they have separate awards for all those folks who are being very, very creative. T-Mobile also created a campaign where they had a fake wedding between a fake Prince William and Kate Middleton. And it was an ad that was never run on TV, but it was one that went straight to YouTube. And it was a fun kind of ad, kind of poking fun at the royal family and that kind of thing. And it got about 25, 26 million views on YouTube. So again, it's really trying to do something creative and innovative to capture people's attention. And the important thing that you want to take away from this, the more creative it is, no matter where it starts, be it on TV or on the internet, it has more of an extended life. So that's why when we see those Super Bowl ads, they have an extended life well beyond the day of the Super Bowl. We watch them on YouTube and many other channels. But what we've seen recently, the last couple of years, many of these ads are even previewed before the Super Bowl. So we see these ads even before the Super Bowl is launched. And so it's all about creating content that is engaging, that's innovative, that allows people to say, yeah, let me go see that again, and maybe pass it on and spread it virally through friend networks. So what should the strategy be in terms of the messaging? I mean, generally, it depends on the product and the product category. At a bare minimum, you should identify what the benefits are. Why should people be buying your product? And it should be connected to solving some kind of problem. So you just can't have funny ads. I mean, funny ads are great, but if you don't communicate what the brand is, the benefits of the brand, and how those benefits solve a specific problem, you're missing out on an opportunity. So you really have to think about it in terms of the message itself. It has to tie back to something that equates a benefit for the potential purchaser. And so when they have these creative concepts, we have to think about the different types of appeals that we want to have. Again, it goes back to the specific product that we have. It goes back to the target market, and all those things can determine the different kinds of characteristics we want to have in the message itself. So obviously it should be, satisfy three different conditions. It should be meaningful. Again, it's for the target market. It should be meaningful to the target market that we're looking at. It should be believable. Having a spokesperson that does not speak to the target market makes no sense, because they will not believe them. So senior citizens, for example, would not buy Paris Hilton as a spokesperson for a product that's targeted to 70, 75-year-olds. It just doesn't make sense. So it has to be somebody believable, and it has to be something distinctive, something different, something that differentiates it from everything else. And usually that will go a real long way to creating something that is memorable, and will take you into, I guess, what I would call the advertising afterlife, which essentially is YouTube and some of the other video types of sites. Execution is always going to be very important too. I think I mentioned this in the previous chapter. The execution is not only the words that are put onto a script. In this day and age, there are a lot of very full theatrical base. They almost look like small, in terms of size, music videos in some ways, or theatrical types of representations. And so they hire oftentimes high-priced Hollywood executives, especially for the Super Bowl spots. They hire these very, very well-recognized Hollywood directors to actually shoot some of these commercials, because sometimes it's really having the right appeal, the right focus, the right tone and style. It's not just the words. All that gets into the execution. And so sometimes you can have the same message on a piece of paper, but the creativity that might come with a particular director might make or break a particular project. And of course, when we're talking about Hollywood executives like Hollywood directors, we're talking about sometimes maybe doubling or tripling the cost to produce a certain type of video or as a commercial. But there are different types of things in terms of what we want to get from advertising generally. Remember, every time we show a message, we're trying to capture people's attention, keep their attention, and have them have a good connection of our brand to those things that are relevant and real to them. And so these 9 boxes here, generally, they are not all inclusive, but generally these are the general categories that we'll see when we think about advertising. Advertising that talks about lifestyle, they integrate music into it, they establish a certain kind of mood or imagery. Maybe it might be some thrill-seeking kind of video for an automobile, an advertising for an automobile, where they're showing you taking this vehicle, SUV, off-road, and showing you how exhilarating it can be to actually engage with that particular product. Maybe it's a testimonial. You might have an endorsement from a particular well-known person who, again, really speaks to the target market. Maybe when we think about pharmaceuticals, they usually provide scientific evidence that really supports the fact that their product helps to solve the problem or ailment that someone might have. So there are a variety of different things that you can use in the messaging. I guess the important point is, before you decide how you want to create this message, you need to sit down and say, who is my target market and what might be the most appealing way for them to have their imagination captured? What's going to stop them from flipping the remote control to another channel? And so once we actually execute it, again, it could be, excuse me, tone could be very important. And it could be something that could be a make or break situation for a particular product. If we're talking about a very fun and frivolous kind of product, for example, you'll see them with SLR cameras, where it's usually kind of frivolous, it's fun, it's usually more upbeat, it's very positive. And that is something that kind of gets your attention. It helps you focus on what the message is because you're involved in the actual visuals that you might see. Financial services, traditionally very boring kind of product category. That's why you see they all create characters to grab our attention. So you have Flo from Progressive, or you have the Gecko from Geico, and then you have all these others that actually use characters to grab our attention, where they're building a story, allowing us to get to know the person who represents the brand. And so we see a little bit more, they unfold more and more about that character's personality as they build the series of commercials. So when we want to see what's the next thing that the gecko is going to do, we sit and we pay attention to that commercial. As you remember from what we talked about earlier, that's what we call encoding. Figuring out a way to take the message and encoding it in a way that captures the attention of the person or the target market who will actually see these ads. And places like YouTube and brand websites where they actually set up specific websites for a particular brand, it's really there to provide advertising message content that's longer than the traditional types of commercials. And so sometimes they could be more stories or short stories or webisodes. So you can see a webisode, for example, that might be segments of 10 minutes long. Obviously, you can't do that on TV. That's the one beautiful thing, not the one beautiful thing, but one of the many beautiful things about the internet. It allows you to be more creative, have ideas that would ordinarily be put to the side because of how complicated it would be to execute. You can do that stuff online for a relatively inexpensive cost. And so many times it really keeps a real good, fresh perspective on the brand. And so if it's a lifestyle-oriented kind of brand, you create things that are really interesting and fun for people. All that really goes a long way to making sure that people continue to connect with your brand. Now, this is going to be the end of the first part of this video. In the next part, we're going to talk about how we actually go about selecting media. And so once we figure out what the message is, we figure out who the target market is and how we're going to connect with them, the question will be, how do we select which medium to actually use to connect with the target market? So I will see you on the other side, part 2.